Hegel thinks that's how we have to think about the world, because that's the way everything is. It comes back to what you said in the beginning about relation, right? Like everything is in relation. So to just choose, we can even take a dicey example today, right? Like Ukraine had to be invadable by Russia in order for that to happen. That doesn't mean we shouldn't be collectively outraged or whatever, but it had to. And the same thing with Taiwan right now. Taiwan has to be invadable by China or it couldn't happen.
Right. Well, listen, but now that we're talking about politics,
yeah,
we're going to keep recording, but I'm going to end. This is at 45 minutes. This part is over and we'll go for a little bit longer. And for the patrons only, I want to talk to you about political things, and maybe they'll relate. Hopefully we'll find a way to relate them to what we've come to in our philosophical conversation, but who knows?
The death of God is about the drying up of a horizon of meaning and of a whole form of human life.
Where do we stand in the illusion it makes? What kind of space are we invited into?
The material relations between people become social relations between things. When we look at toasters, corn, and TVs, we
still, to a large extent, live in the interregnum between worlds, if you will, or between paradigms. Not many people in the history of the world have faced that.
Diet Soap is a Sublation Media podcast. All right, so Todd McGowan is an author with Sublation Press. We have a book coming out called Enjoyment, Right and Left. I always want to get I
know it's either enjoyment or enjoyment, but I think it is enjoyment. I think that's what we said.
Enjoyment, right and left. You also wrote Emancipation After Hegel. You're a podcaster, a YouTube star, a professor. You sport a mean cap and a regular guest on the Diet Soap podcast. So Todd McGowan, welcome back. Before I pressed record, we were talking about Zizek and Pinkard and that conversation. Hardly call it really a debate about Hegel and Kant and the different interpretations of Hegel. And what I was asking you is if you could present the differences between some interpretations like Pippin's and Pinkard's interpretation of Hegel and Zizek's in a way that maybe Zizek was reluctant to because he's such a affable.
He's a nice guy, right? Right. He's a nice guy. I hope I'm a nice guy too, but yeah, Pinkard's not here, so I could do that.
Right.
Yeah. So Slavoj once he took this joke, and it's the only time he's ever taken a joke from me and attributed it to me. And this is actually a joke I didn't come up with, but the joke goes like this: I tried to read Hegel, but I found out that I can't. Right. And so his point was in telling the joke was that this is really what characterizes what we could call the Pittsburgh reading of the Pittsburgh Hegelian school. And Pinkard is, I don't know, he said more loosely aligned with that. It's Robert Brandom and Robert Pippin, especially. But Pinkard, I think, is associated with it. And so the joke gets at this idea that it's a Kantianization of Hegel. It's seeing that, so Kant tries to lay out the limits of knowledge, right? The limits of what we can know. And one of the ways that a certain line in analytic philosophy has looked at Kant was he's looking at the limits of what can be spoken, right? And so what language contains as possibility. So the idea is that Hegel just extends that. He just sees the way in which there's certain limitations on our thought that go beyond what Kant thought they go. And so I think that's one of the ways that there's a difference between what Slavoj wants to do, which is preserve an ontological and not just an epistemological Hegel. So what that means is that he thinks that Hegel has some speculation about the way things actually are, not just about what we can say about the way things actually are. And so that Kantianization of Hegel is saying, no, really what Hegel's talking about is what we can say about the way things are, that there's no speculation about the way things actually are. And it's interesting, you and I were just talking before that when when Pinkard talked about Slavoy's approach, he said, well, you're really more like a Schelling than a Hegel. And so when you talk about Hegel, I just substitute in Schelling because Schelling felt free to talk about the natural world in a way and make these claims about it in a way that Hegel didn't. Okay, so that's
right. Now, I have to confess, I have not read or studied Schelling at all. Right?
Yeah.
I've read the Phenomenology of Spirit and some of the Science of Logic. I've read Kant. I have an undergraduate degree in philosophy, which I feel is as good as any undergraduate degree in philosophy. But I don't know Schelling's work. But how is Schelling usually compared to Hegel? What are their primary differences?
Right. So just a little background on that. So what's interesting is that Schelling's 5 years younger than Hegel, but they were roommates along with Friedrich Hölderlin at the seminary in Tübingen. So the three of them were together in a dorm room. And this is a stupid background, but a good friend of mine once said, I don't think they played a lot of video games in that dorm room. I always liked that. But so Schelling, even though he's 5 years younger, he becomes a star in the 1790s. So well before Hegel does, a good 20 some years before Hegel does. So, and that's a source of friction later, but basically their position was the same initially, right? So Schelling wrote his first big book was called System of Transcendental Idealism, published in 1800. And that's 7 years before phenomenology. And it does a lot of the things that the phenomenology does, except that Schelling thinks that we can know about, he is much more sanguine about our knowledge of nature than Hegel is. So Hegel thinks we can know about the natural world indirectly through the structure of subjectivity, right? So because we know something about subjectivity, we can deduce from that certain claims about the natural world. Schelling thinks, eventually he'll think, we can actually just make certain claims about the natural world and the way through the way that we relate to it. So so he's much more sanguine about talking about the natural world, and he's much more invested in art as revelatory for somewhat the nature of subjectivity. So those I think are the two main differences, but they're not huge differences. I mean, they're part of the same constellation. And but Schelling, so Hegel's star really eclipsed Schelling's when he wrote basically when he got the job in Berlin in 1817. And Schelling was there, so their trajectory is kind of going opposite. So, and then Schelling lived until 1850s, and he was, I don't know, consumed maybe is overstating it, but really jealous, I think, of Hegel's success. But anyway, so I think the ability of Schelling to make claims about the natural world, that's what Pinkard was when he called Slavoj what did he say? Like you're like a Schelling for today, or when you're talking about Hegel, I think you're talking about Schelling. Whatever he said, I think he's thinking about that especially.
Well, okay, there's something interesting about the phrase "natural world" here, because when you talk about the natural world, it seems like you're talking about scientific categories, the whether or not we can understand biology or ecological systems or the way the sun functions and why it burns and things like that. And then but there's this other question of which is, to what extent can we know what is, to what extent can we know being? And so from my way of thinking, this is maybe particularly eccentric, or perhaps it's just contemporary, but there's a difference between claims to be able to know the natural world scientifically and claims to be able to know being. Mm. And maybe that's probably fairly problematic to make that distinction, but or at least it raises issues. But I feel as though you can have this fundamental problem of epistemology, and basically the problem of how our understanding relates to what really actually is outside of our understanding. and not be very skeptical about our ability to develop scientific categories of understanding
that are realistic,
that are practical, or
right.
that, in some way or another function, like we can know the natural world well enough to get to the moon, but when we're on the moon, we can't know if those craters have any relationship to what actually is. If that makes sense.
Right. No, that makes a lot of sense. I think that distinction's pretty fair. I think that's I think that's pretty good. And I think what's interesting is you could make the argument, I don't know if I totally think this, but I think you could make the argument that Schelling thinks that we can know the natural world in both ways, and Hegel just in the second way. But I'm not sure about that, because Hegel has a whole and this is why.
And which one's the second way? The natural world as systems of
we can just know being, right? Like we can just.
Okay.
Yeah. Or I reversed the ways that you put it, but
I think I did. Anyway, go ahead.
Yeah,
I understand.
But I think that what's interesting is that Hegel writes, so the encyclopedia, the whole second section, 3 sections, the whole second section is the philosophy of nature. And he goes through, chemism, mechanism. He thinks, biology wasn't quite a thing yet, but he's basically doing that. So, and he's thinking about it in terms of how we, like, just the actual sciences that exist and what they tell us about the structure of what's interesting though, it's for him, it's what do those sciences tell us about the structure of our thinking in relation to the world, right? So I think he's more on the side of, we can say something about, we can make ontological claims about being, but like, do those correspond exactly to, like, does our experience of the natural world correspond exactly to how the natural world is? I think he would be not so, I don't know what he would think of that, right? But I think Schelling would think that we could make some claims about that. But I'm not totally comfortable with either of those claims, because I think it's dicey. It's a dicey kind of situation, and that's what, when Pinkard was talking to Slavoj, one of his claims was Hegel thinks the natural world is just kind of splotchy. I think that's the word he used even. Well, I guess, but I think he does want to go through the ways he wants to think about how we think about that world. And again, see if we can draw some ontological conclusions about that. And then, I mean, that, like, one of Slavoj's big things is to think quantum mechanics with Hegel. And so his idea is that actually the sciences have moved in Hegel's direction in the 20th and 21st century through quantum mechanics. So and again, I think that would be an interesting point of difference between the two of them, because I don't think Terry Pinkard would say that at all.
No. Terry Pinkard would just say, when it comes to quantum mechanics, that's outside of my pay grade. I have no idea. Right. So, okay, putting quantum physics because that sounds like, if I'm going to say, if we go with Zizek and point to quantum physics as correlating to Hegel's ontological claims, then we may be making a move towards Schelling.
Right. I would just say that I think that's the thing that maybe triggered Terry Pinkard to say what he did about I assume he's read Less Than Nothing, and that's where most of that gets done in Less Than Nothing. So,
right. Yeah. Less Than Nothing being the title of a book and not a slam on Pinkard's.
No, not at all. Not at all. No.
I assume Pinkard's read Less Than Nothing.
No. Right.
All right.
Slavoj wrote a book called, it's 1,000 pages on Hegel.
Yeah. I know. I'm sure most of the audience.
Most of the audience probably knows. Yeah.
So I'm going to back up a little bit, because I want to get to, look, I just want to kind of, I wrote a bunch of questions down, and they're just a way of me trying to grasp my own impasse here. So So in my conversation with Pinkard and Zizek, I attempted to grasp their difference in terms of ontology or being. Being is where Hegel begins in his Science of Logic. But as you point out in The State of Capital, Hegel's critique of bourgeois society, being is an abstract category for Hegel. It's an abstract category that leads to the concrete. That is, because pure being seems immediate, it can't stand up to philosophical scrutiny. Hegel demonstrates that pure being is, in fact, nothing, and that nothing is pure being, or that it passes over into pure being while remaining distinct from it. So it seems to me that I'm just realizing, like, if you aren't steeped in this is like maybe nonsense.
It's like sounds like nonsense. Yeah.
Yeah. It seems to me that Hegel is pointing to the process of cognition when he describes this process, as well as pointing to the history of philosophical inquiry into being.
Yep.
But is he also pointing to a characteristic of being in itself? Is being an ontological category for Hegel, or is it an epistemic quality?
Okay. Yeah, that's a great question, Doug. So, right, so he says the science of logic is a description of the mind of God prior to creation, right? Which is a crazy thing. But so the idea is that logic is somehow has ontological implications. And I think that's something, there's another maybe point of distinction between the two camps but I think that's really important to Hegel. So I think when he's talking about being in the very beginning of the logic, he's not talking about how things actually are. There he's talking about how we try to theorize how things are. And he's showing that just talking about pure being. So what Heidegger calls the forgetting of being, Hegel would say, yeah, well, we had to forget because it's just an abstract category. And if you just talk about pure being, you're not really talking about anything that can be distinguished from nothing in any concrete way. And from that, he gets to becoming, which you could say is the entirety of Hegel's philosophy, because it's really a philosophy of becoming. Somebody has even written it's a philosophy of pure becoming. I don't think that's totally right, but I think there's something to that. So I think that's what I would say. I think that when he's talking about being the beginning of the logic, that's not being in the sense that he thinks that's a way of missing how being actually works. And how being actually works is what we get throughout the path. We take the path of the logic. That's how we uncover it.
When you say pure being, what you're saying is what it is to exist without any particular distinct qualities. So it's not what it is to exist as a table or what it is to exist as a slime mold, but it is just what it is to exist.
Existing itself, right. And so once you concretize that at all, it's no longer pure being.
Right. But what would pure becoming be? It'd be, I guess, the same thing. It'd just be what it is to move from to be interpreted, to be mediated, to move from being into nothing and back into being again. But I don't know. I do agree that to try to comprehend pure becoming is tricky in a way that pure being isn't, and I'm not quite sure why.
Well, I think that's interesting that that's true, but I think what pure becoming is just grasping that movement from being to nothing, right? Like, but once it's concretized in someone's individual life, like, I had chest pains yesterday. I was thinking like, oh, the end is coming. Once that's not pure becoming because it's already concretized in my life. So it's just that moment.
How are you? Are you okay?
I'm okay. It was a stupid muscle injury. So, So, but I think that it's just as hard. I mean, that's Hegel's point, really, right? That we can't think pure being, we can't think pure nothing, and we can't think pure becoming, because whenever we try to do it, we always give it some kind of concrete form, right? Like I think my own moving into nothingness, and that's not pure becoming, right? So that's the problem. And he draws from that we can conclude that if we can't think that way, and I think this is where the distance between Kant and Hegel, and this is maybe a point of difference that didn't get drawn out in that discussion. He thinks if we can't think that way, then it can't actually be that way, right? Like that's one of his ideas, that if we're forced into a certain way of thinking or comporting ourselves, then there has to be some force of the things themselves that are pushing us in that direction. He thinks that, right? So that's that of course we can have fantasies that don't fit into but we still have to be able to have those fantasies, right? Like there can't be that, like if the world was free, it was harmonious and free of contradiction, then we wouldn't be able to think becoming. That's just for instance, like like if there was a such thing as pure being, then we wouldn't be able to think the question of pure being. That would be Hegel's idea, right?
Right. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Okay. I kind of am beginning to understand,
Yeah.
but this is always like, I really find this argument to be compelling, but then it always sort of slips away from me, as I try to hold on to it. So I written down something, when I first tried to read Hegel, like in the early 2010s, not in my early 20s, but in like early 2010s, I made an attempt to explain the phenomenology to my 14-year-old son, Ben. And I recall telling him that if we tried to imagine the universe without life in it, we would find that we weren't able to imagine anything. That if we were to think about the surface of the moon again, before any life emerged anywhere, whatever images we'd come up with would include ourselves, our eyes or our minds in the image. Mm-hmm. That's a necessary component in any imagining. Mm-hmm. And so we'd have to reject those images. Life and being, perception and essence seem to be interconnected, even if we had to presuppose that the moon existed before human beings or any form of life emerged. Even if we had to posit a moon out there beyond us in space and time, we also had to understand ourselves in relationship to the moon in order for the moon to exist, in order for it to actually be.
Okay.
So that is, life and being aren't separate. But when I said that, my son, not being an idiot, said, "But you're saying, that unless people perceive it, it doesn't exist." I worry that there's a solipsistic turn here.
So, right.
Yeah. And right. So how do we avoid that if we're going to claim that the substance of the universe of being does connect to our own subjectivity? It does, that our subjectivity is, the fact of it tells us something about being. How do we avoid a solipsistic turn?
Right. Well, because I think for Hegel, it works in both directions, right? So it's not just that so you're right to emphasize the relational nature of everything for Hegel. That's really important, that we can't think something that's out of relation to ourselves, because then we wouldn't be thinking the thing. We'd be imagining something that's out of relation to ourselves. But I would say that there's that for Hegel, it's not just that how we are comported shapes how we think of the thing. It's also how the thing is comported shapes how we think. So, and shapes the structure of our being or our lives. So it's not just one thing or the other. That's why I think that really important line that he repeats, I think 6 times in some form or the other in the preface of Phenomenology, substance is subject, right? Like it means that my subjectivity is involved with any apprehension of the way things are, but vice versa. It means that the subject, the thing that seems substantial and out there and just solid, is also affecting me. And it's also divided and contradictory, and that's shaping me. And so you can't, just as the how the moon appears is related to us and our subjectivity, so is our subjectivity a result of certain effects of space and all that stuff. So I think for Hegel it goes both directions, and I think that's what saves it from being. I think it's interesting, the word solipsism. I think it's totally anti-solipsistic philosophy. Like I think because it's a totally relational philosophy.
I read Bishop George Berkeley before I read Hegel, right? So
yeah,
and so when he claims that pure being is indistinguishable from nothing.
Yeah.
I read in Berkeley. I read in, okay, when you try to imagine a being or matter, you're only dealing with an abstraction, which is a linguistic category of understanding, but which could not be in itself. It has no qualities in itself. Therefore, it is nothing. It doesn't exist. Therefore, you're making a mistake. And, when a tree falls in the quad, God hears it, but otherwise it wouldn't make a sound.
Right. That's an interesting. You're a good Berkeley reader, because most people that cite Berkeley, they're like, if a tree falls in the quad and nobody's there, nobody hears it. But of course, for Berkeley, God hears it. That's how. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. It's Doug. It's so fascinating you would say that, because I was in graduate school, and I too read Berkeley, I think Principles of Human Knowledge or something, prior to reading Hegel, and right before. And then I read Hegel, and I was reading it in an independent study with a friend of mine, a professor who became a friend. And I said, well, isn't this just, here's what I said. I says, isn't this just Berkeley socialized? Like Berkeley seen as, but it's social. And he's like, no, you've misunderstood it totally. So it's interesting that I had that same reaction when I first read, because I think there is a temptation to think that he emphasizes subjectivity so much. You think, oh, this is he just means all there is what we're perceiving, right? But I think you have to think it also the other way around for him, or else you miss
right.
it.
Well, okay, but all right. So, let me tell you what my problem with Berkeley was. What saved me from becoming a solipsist, other than the fact that it was a terrible approach to life, especially if you wanted to date. But here's what saved me. Berkeley needed God. Right. In order for his system to cohere. You couldn't, the realm of perception alone did lead to solipsism, and then it led to difficulties that were you couldn't resolve. Like, does a sailboat actually get smaller when you walk away from it?
Right.
Problems of perception like that. There are all sorts of assumptions that we made about the physical world that weren't actually immediate to our perception. Right. And matter was one of them. And God, for Berkeley, was one of them too. It was a necessary background conception,
right,
that set up a coherent understanding of the world, set up human perception, say.
Right.
So if you then apply Berkeley's own critique of matter to God, you'll find God is nothing too, because God is infinite and finite, and everything and nothing, and it's without any qualities, can't be limited. It's all the same kind of problem.
Yeah.
So God disappears into nothing just as easily as matter does for Berkeley. If you take, Berkeley can't really stand on God.
Right. Berkeley wouldn't say that.
No, but it just if you think it through, it doesn't make sense. So, all right. So then you're left with solipsism, which also can't cohere, right?
Right.
And then so when I read Hegel, I say, okay, Hegel is saying that ontologically there's a contradiction or incoherence in the world. It's not just in us. It's this tendency that we see in philosophy. It's necessary. The split between subject and object isn't just in the subject, but it's in both the object and the subject. But and I can say that, and that sounds all neat and everything, but there's still, I feel like, a missing piece. Like there's what I really feel like where I end up is going, nothing makes sense. Nothing will cohere. It's all contradictory, and that's just life. Get used to it. Move on. Which could push you into a kind of anti-philosophical perspective, right?
I guess, but don't you think that? I mean, Hegel's point is actually that it takes a lot to see contradiction, right? Like it's not just, I mean, look how difficult it is for Kant. Like he has to work through the antinomies. Like that takes a lot of arguing and a lot of structure of thought. Like, I think for Hegel, like just throwing up your hands and say, oh yeah, everything is contradictory is like, no, like I think the commonsensical attitude is the Ayn Randian attitude, the Aristotelian attitude that A equals A, right? That it all just, everything is self-identical. And I think you're only able to throw up your hands in that cynical way. I think that's what you're suggesting, kind of cynicism. Yeah. You're only able to throw up your hands like that if you accept that A equals A, that you accept that the world is non-contradictory, because you're like, the world's non-contradictory, I can't do anything about it. But if you think the world is contradictory, then the onus is on you to do something about the way things are, right? Because nothing is, I mean, I think in a way, this is one idea from Hegel that Marx really takes over, right? That, look, capitalism is contradictory, so we can do something about it, right? Like, it's not Adam Smith is wrong. It's not David Ricardo is wrong. There's nothing natural about the way these relations are going along. So that means we can do something about it. I think that's absolutely Hegel's point. That contradiction is it impels us to act. It's not like, oh, now I can just sit back, because just sitting back is already accepting that you think things are identical, even if you're telling yourself that you think they're contradictory, right? Like you're, and I think this is a really important idea for Hegel. This happens throughout phenomenology, throughout logic. It's always like you might be telling yourself one thing, but if we like you just did with Berkeley, right? If we trace out the implications of your position, you actually think something far different than what you are telling yourself.
Yeah,
right. So
right.
That happens all the time. Yeah.
And okay, so this I'll confess that right before I talked to you, I had a remote therapy session, and that's one of the things that you try to, as a philosopher, you want to think everything through, right? But in therapy, you've got to have this guy who's forcing you to think it through. Otherwise, you'll just, oh, well, God exists in the quad. Let's put it over there. So how does Hegel relate to like psychoanalysis and psychological therapy and all of that kind of thing, the Lacan, in that way? Do you think that we have a block to understanding Hegel the way we might have a block to understanding our own symptoms?
Wow, that's a good question. First of all, let me just say that in the circles I hang out with, one doesn't confess one's therapy, one brags about it. So
okay.
It's a total opposite. We're in far different circles. It's because
right.
Yeah. So and if you're not in therapy, that's what you have to confess. Like, sorry, I'm not.
I flunked out of therapy. I quit on it. I'm a quitter.
Yeah. So it's a fascinating thing. I've never thought about it in those terms, and I think that there's something really fecund about that maybe it is true that, and it has to be true for Hegel himself, right? Like he's not someone like Jacques Lacan, you just mentioned. Lacan tries to write badly and tries to be indecipherable. Hegel thought he was doing a good job, which just shows how self-deceived he was. But I think it might be this, like there might be a kind of psychic barrier to the path that Hegel was trying to go down. And Hegel himself encountered it. That makes a lot of sense to me. I've never heard.
What would it be? Do you think that we want to avoid thinking through?
Look, I just talked over everything.
That's all right. That's great. That means that we're having a good, exciting conversation.
Okay, yeah. Except it's not good for people trying to listen. But I think that what it is that the way he anticipates the unconscious, right? Like Freud's point about unconscious is contradictory ideas can exist in the unconscious without offsetting each other, right? Like they're just there side by side. The unconscious is contradictory. And I've always thought that, not always, 10 years, whatever, that Hegel anticipates psychoanalysis because of his understanding of the way subjectivity runs aground on contradiction all the time, right? So that I think is a psychoanalytic idea. But I had always assumed, and I still sort of think this, that that is no one before Freud really theorizes the unconscious in the way that Freud and psychoanalysis do. And I don't think Hegel does, but I think he's moving in that direction, which is, I think, what the barrier is to himself being able to articulate his own thinking satisfactorily.
Yeah. Okay. So, now I want to ask you about the difference between everyday understanding of the unconscious and like a Freudian or Lacanian understanding, because the way most people, I think, understand the unconscious is that you have maybe a lizard brain or some early primitive parts of your brain which aren't part of the prefrontal cortex, and therefore are directing you to breathe, and they're directing you to, produce saliva, and, making you horny sometimes. And then, you have the prefrontal cortex, which is trying to process the unconscious, right? That's not what you mean when you talk about unconscious.
No. Good. Yes. Very good. That's not it. No. So Freud, interestingly, I think, starts out believing that the unconscious is the objects that we desire because they're so socially unacceptable, right? So he starts out thinking, well, like, what's unconscious is the way that I desire. I'm just going to choose the most banal Freudian example. Like, I have the Oedipal desire for my mother, and I can't bring that into consciousness. It's too painful. And so it's repressed, right? Like that and I think that's his idea up until he writes Beyond the Pleasure Principle in 1920. And then I think his idea is much more interesting. Then he says the unconscious is this other place that operates in a logic that defies consciousness, right? So in the unconscious, we seek out our own. The unconscious has basically a masochistic structure to it. We seek out our own destruction. Consciously, we cannot do that. We can't think in those terms. It's like, consciously, we're all like Pascal, who says everyone wants to be happy, even the person that kills himself. He just imagines that's happiness, right? Mm-hmm. But I think Freud, so there you can see that, and that's the logic of consciousness. And for Freud, the unconscious is the opposite. It's like you're trying to just undermine yourself in whatever way that you can. And so you go into therapy to realize all the ways in which you're trying to undermine yourself, right? And try to find a way, not to get out of that, but to find a way to make that compatible with staying alive and doing okay, right? So that's
right. Those two definitions of what the unconscious is, Freudian, the objects of desires, the things that we want because they're unacceptable, like Norman Bates' love for his mother,
right,
which is unconscious and disassociated, right? And this unconscious being the realm of self-destruction, the realm of self-undermining thought. Those aren't really in odds with each other, right?
I think they kind of are, but I think you could, I guess you could say that they're not. And Freud himself.
Well, maybe if you think that the reason why the objects of desire are desirable because they're socially unacceptable, not on their own. It wasn't that Norman's mother was so hot, right? but it was the fact that she was the taboo,
right?
That drove him in an act that was self-undermining. To dress up like his mother, and
that's pretty good, Doug. I've that undermines me a little bit because I like to have them totally opposed because I'm not a believer in the Oedipus complex at all, and so it's probably because my mother is so
hot. Because your mom's so hot, you don't believe in the Oedipus complex.
Yeah, she's not hot, but she just weighed heavily on me psychically. But I think that I do think that makes a little bit of sense to me that you could, because choosing the unacceptable object is a way of self-undermining, right? Like that does. So they do kind of fit together. I hadn't thought of that. That's a good point. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, right. It's saying what is taboo in and of itself is what is desirable, which is like, like if you tell your kids, don't do drugs, they'll destroy you. Those drugs become more desirable,
Right.
because of that
Right.
prohibition.
So it's an interesting question. Are they desirable because you have interdicted them, or are they desirable because they will destroy you? Right. Like, I think that's the difference between those two forms of the unconscious.
Oh, right. Yeah. I mean, yeah, you have to, if those, right. It could be that you just want to defy.
Right.
Right. There's an aggressive desire to defy
Right.
the parental or patriarchal authority.
Right.
Or it could be that, you believe dad, and therefore now these things are more desirable.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think there is a difference still. Like, the one way you could think about it is there's a movement away from the object in Freud, right? Like he ceases to think the object means that much. And I kind of like that. I think that's
right. Yeah. And you like that not only because you're trying to escape the Oedipal complex.
No, not just because of that, although that's probably part of it. Right. There's a great joke. This guy comes into goes to see a psychoanalyst, and he goes, the analyst says to him, he goes, don't worry, I'm not one of those psychoanalysts who's focused on the Oedipal complex. And the guy goes, well, who do I see if I want to sleep with my mother? So that's my situation.
That's a great joke. So yeah, okay. I'm going to now, on that note, go back to Hegel. We've gotten into uncomfortable territory. No, the thing about this is, okay. Let's see if I can actually segue into it rather than just
good.
cut to it. So this desire to, it's not a desire, but the propensity to be self-undermining is the what sets up the unconscious, right? And in Hegel, the self-undermining quality is not merely a category of human understanding. It's not just a part of our psyche, but there's a quality of self-undermining, a propensity to self-undermine in the physical world itself, in matter, in being.
Right. Right. That's right. And so that's why I said I think Hegel anticipates the unconscious, right? Because he sees the way that both, and I like what you said, so both every position that we take ends up undermining itself, like you did with Berkeley, and matter itself does it. Right. The physical world itself is constantly doing it. Right. So it's not just like Hegel uses the example of, we think an apple is this solid thing, but you can take a bite out of it. Right. So I think there's a way you could say all of Hegel's thought is reducible to this, that this is not true. It's exaggeration, but that in order to be eaten, an apple must be biteable. Right. Like, and he wants to, I think we don't like to think that way. Like, we like to think, no, there are people that are aggressive actors doing a certain thing, and they're the agents in the world, and other people who have things done to them, or the things that have things done to them, they're the passive recipients of that action. And Hegel's point is, okay, it's not a moral point. Like, he's not saying like those people, everyone's equal morally. He's just saying, in order for something to happen to something or someone, it has to be they have to allow it to happen to them. Right. So, but it's not a question of judging them or making a moral claim about anything like that. It's just saying, it's just a claim about the way relation is always functioning. Right. So yeah, that's all. And I think it's a really important point. Like, things must be able to happen, or they wouldn't. It sounds dumb to say, or they wouldn't happen. Right.
Right. Well, right. I don't know. Forgive me for this, but last night I watched What We Do in the Shadows. So everything just refers to, like, in my mind, I have to think through pop culture. It's like all I have.
No, that's good.
So in one of the episodes, the vampire hunter character is challenged to a fight with against another human being, just a regular person. And I thought to myself, I know that character cannot be defeated by a vampire. He's not the kind of character that can be defeated by a vampire. So there's no worries there. But could another human being defeat him? Does he? I don't know. And so there was real tension for the first time in like a whole season, whether or not he was going to win these fights. But of course, it turned out, no, he can't be defeated by human beings. But so yeah, it's in a sense, it does matter what kind of being you are as to whether or not as to what's going to happen to you, or what kind of action or will can be forced upon you. Like,
right. I mean, that's just how Hegel thinks. That's how we have to think about the world, because that's the way everything is. It comes back to what you said in the beginning about relation, right? Like everything is in relation. So to just choose, we can even take a dicey example today, right? Like Ukraine had to be invadable by Russia in order for that to happen. That doesn't mean we shouldn't be collectively outraged or whatever, but it had to. And the same thing with Taiwan right now. Taiwan has to be invadable by China or it couldn't happen, right? So, like right now, the United States is not invadable by Belgium, right? It's just not. It's not possible. So that's part of what it means to be the United States and Belgium, or Taiwan and China, right? Like that's all. That's part of what that thing is for Hegel. So it's not. But again, it's not a moral or political judgment in any way. It's just saying it's an ontological judgment, actually.
Right. Well, listen, but now that we're talking about politics, we're going to keep recording, but I'm going to end. This is at 45 minutes. This part is over, and we'll go for a little bit longer. And for the patrons only, I want to talk to you about political things, and maybe they'll relate. Hopefully we'll find a way to relate them to what we've come to in our philosophical conversation, but who knows?